Story number 1. The unmoving passenger. I've always found solace in the rhythmic clatter of train tracks beneath my feet. There's something inherently comforting about the steady motion, the predictable stops, and the fleeting glimpses of the world outside the window. But on that frigid winter night, the train ride from Dallas to Houston would etch itself into my memory as something far more unsettling. It was 2 a.m., the hour when most of the world was lost in dreams, and I was wide awake, staring blankly at the reflection of my tired eyes in the window. The train was nearly empty, save for a few scattered passengers engrossed in their own thoughts or asleep in their seats. I had boarded in a hurry after a long shift at the gas station, eager to get some rest before my next shift began. As the train sped through the desolate Texas landscape, blanketed in snow, I settled into my seat in the corner of car 3B. The warmth of the overhead lights contrasted sharply with the biting cold outside, creating a cocoon of comfort that made the hours stretch interminably. About 15 minutes into the journey, I noticed her. First, she was just a silhouette against the dim light, a lone figure seated in the far corner of the car. She wore a long, dark coat that reached almost to the floor, her posture rigid and unyielding. Her face was obscured by the shadow of her hood, and she seemed entirely absorbed in her own world. Head bowed and hands clasped tightly in her lap, I glanced around, thinking perhaps she was just another night traveler, someone seeking solitude or lost in their own thoughts. But there was something unnerving about her stillness, an unnatural rigidity that set her apart from the rest of the passengers. As the minutes ticked by, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me. Her presence was silent, yet palpable, an invisible weight pressing down on the car. I tried to focus on my phone, scrolling through social media feeds to distract myself. But every so often, I caught her gaze flicking up towards mine. Her eyes, if I could call them that, held an intensity that made my skin crawl. Curiosity got the better of me. I took a deep breath and decided to make small talk, hoping to break the ice and dispel the unease that had settled in my stomach. "Hey," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are you waiting for someone?" She didn't respond. Her head remained bowed, her hands still clasped tightly together. I chuckled nervously, shaking my head. "All right, maybe you're just tired." But the silence persisted, and I found myself stealing glances at her every now and then, trying to decipher any emotion or movement. Hours passed, and the train continued its journey through the bleak, snowy expanse. The other passengers had long since succumbed to sleep, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the enigmatic woman in the corner. As dawn began to break, the first hints of sunlight filtered through the window, casting a pale glow over the interior of the train. I was still restless, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the train began to slow, signaling our approach to Houston. I gathered my belongings, my mind racing with questions about the silent passenger. Was she real, or just a figment of my exhausted imagination? As the train pulled into the station, I hesitated for a moment, my gaze lingering on her one last time. The doors opened, and passengers began to disembark, their groggy movements a stark contrast to my heightened state of alertness. I made my way through the car, every step echoing in the empty space, until I reached the door to exit. Glancing back, I realized she hadn't moved an inch, still sitting there with her head bowed, as if rooted to the spot. I approached her, heart pounding, and gently knocked on the seat in front of her. "Excuse me," I said softly. "Are you okay? Do you need any help?" She remained motionless, her head still tilted downward. I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense of dread washing over me. Before I could react, her head snapped up, revealing a face that was both hauntingly beautiful and terrifyingly empty. Her eyes, wide and devoid of life, bore into mine with an intensity that left me breathless. "Help me," she whispered, her voice echoing through the silent car. Frozen with fear, I stumbled backward, my mind reeling with the implications of her plea. What do you mean? How can I help you? Her lips curled into a sorrowful smile, and she slowly lifted a hand, pointing towards the floor beneath her seat. Find me. Panic surged through me as I glanced around, noticing for the first time the subtle signs of neglect in the abandoned sections of the train. The seats were worn, the upholstery frayed, and the air heavy with the scent of decay. I realized she wasn't just a passenger. She was something else entirely, a spirit trapped within the confines of the train. I don't understand, I whispered, backing away. I can't help you. Her form began to shimmer, the edges of her figure blurring as if she were fading into the air. You have to, she insisted, her voice growing more urgent. I can't leave. With trembling hands, I reached down to inspect the area beneath her seat, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. There, partially hidden beneath a folded blanket, was an old, faded photograph. It depicted a young woman standing in front of a train station, her face radiant and full of life. But in the background, there was a shadowy figure standing ominously, watching her. Who are you? I demanded, holding up the photograph. She looked at the image, her expression one of profound sadness. I was waiting for him, she murmured. He never came. The train pulled out of the station, the wheels clattering against the tracks as we resumed our journey. I stood there, the photograph clenched in my hand, staring blankly at the woman who had just shared her tragic story. As the sun rose higher, casting light into the car, her figure began to fade, her presence dissipating like mist in the morning breeze. Goodbye, she whispered, her voice barely audible as she vanished entirely, leaving me alone with the haunting memory of her sorrow. Determined to uncover the truth, I spent the next few days delving into the history of the train line and the station we had departed from. The more I researched, the more the pieces began to fit together. Years ago, there had been a tragic accident on that very route, a collision caused by a faulty signal, resulting in the deaths of several passengers, including a young woman named Clara Bennett. Clara had been traveling to meet her fiancé, promising young man named Daniel. At the Houston station, the accident had occurred just before dawn, trapping her in the wreckage. Rescue efforts were hampered by the harsh winter conditions, and she was never found. Her body never recovered. The incident had left the community in mourning, with whispers of her spirit lingering on the tracks, forever waiting for Daniel to return. Armed with this knowledge, I returned to the station where the accident had occurred, the memory of Clara's haunting plea driving me forward. The site had been cleared years ago, replaced by a modern structure, but the shadows of the past still lingered in the corners of my mind. I set up my camera, hoping to capture any signs of her lingering presence. As night fell, the same eerie silence enveloped the area, broken only by the distant hum of traffic. I sat in the darkness, watching the tracks where the accident had happened, my heart heavy with empathy for Clara's eternal wait. At exactly 2 a.m., the train arrived, its lights piercing the darkness as it pulled into the station. The doors opened, and the train began to fill with passengers, their faces blurred by the motion. I kept my camera trained on the tracks, waiting for any sign of Clara. Minutes passed with nothing out of the ordinary, and I began to relax, believing that her spirit had finally found peace. But then, just as the clock struck 3 a.m., I saw it, a flicker of movement near the edge of the tracks. A woman in a long coat stood there, her face hidden in the shadows, staring directly at me with hollow eyes. Clara? I whispered, my voice trembling. She didn't respond. Instead, she began to walk towards the train, her movements slow and deliberate. As she drew closer, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply as if the very essence of winter had settled over the area. I felt a chill run down my spine, a sense of dread enveloping me. Please, I called out, standing up to face her. You need to move on. Her head tilted slightly, a gesture that conveyed both confusion and sorrow. I can't leave, she whispered, her voice carrying the weight of countless unspoken emotions. He's still waiting for me. Tears welled up in my eyes as I realized the depth of her pain. Daniel? He died in the accident. Clara, you need to let go. She looked down, her shoulders slumping as if the burden of her grief weighed her down. I waited for him every night, she murmured. But he never came back. I stepped closer, reaching out a hand in a gesture of comfort. You don't have to wait anymore. Your fiancé is gone. And so are you. It's time to find peace. For a moment, she hesitated, her gaze fixed on mine. Then, slowly, her form began to shimmer, the edges blurring as if she were fading into the air. Thank you, she whispered, a hint of gratitude in her voice. Thank you for helping me let go. As she vanished, the coldness lifted, replaced by a warm, comforting breeze that seemed to carry away her lingering sorrow. The tracks fell silent once more, the night reclaiming its tranquil stillness. In the days that followed, the haunting presence at the station ceased entirely. The memories of Clara's tragic fate remained, a poignant reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and the enduring power of compassion in easing the burdens of those who are lost. I continued my nights at Sam's Groceries with a newfound sense of purpose, knowing that some souls just need a little help finding their way home. And as the winter snows melted into spring, the tracks stood silent, the echoes of the past finally fading into the whispers of the present. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind carries the faintest hint of sorrow, I catch a glimpse of a flickering light on the tracks, a gentle reminder that some spirits never truly leave, and that every cry deserves to be heard and remembered. Story number 2. The Unreflected Passenger. I've always found solace in the rhythmic hum of the subway, the steady motion of the train lulling me into a meditative state as the city blurs past my window. Every morning, I ride the 4 train from Brooklyn to Manhattan, a journey I've taken countless times without incident. But one chilly December night, a simple commute turned into an experience that would forever alter my perception of reality. It was around 11 p.m., the hour when the streets of Brooklyn begin to quiet down, and the city lights cast long shadows on the tracks. I boarded the train at Bedford Avenue, greeted by the familiar faces of a few late-night travelers, an old man nodding in greeting, a young woman lost in her phone, and the usual assortment of tired souls seeking refuge from the bustling day. As the train rattled to life, I settled into my usual seat by the window in car 3B, pulling my coat tighter against the biting cold. The platform outside was nearly empty, save for a solitary figure huddled against the wall, shivering uncontrollably. I offered a sympathetic glance before turning my attention back to my phone, trying to ignore the eerie stillness that had settled over the platform. The train sped through the tunnels, the lights above flickering intermittently as we plunged into the darkness. It was then that I noticed something odd, an extra reflection in the window opposite me. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a fleeting shadow cast by the tunnel's architecture. But as the train continued its journey, the reflection became more distinct. There, sitting across from me, was a man dressed entirely in black. His presence was striking against the dull gray backdrop of the subway car. He sat perfectly still, his posture rigid, staring intently out the window. I tried to shift my gaze away, convincing myself it was just another passenger who preferred to keep to himself. But every few minutes, I found myself glancing back, drawn by the unsettling stillness of his figure. He never moved, never looked away from his seat. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a wide hat, casting deep shadows over his eyes. There was something hauntingly familiar about him, a sense of sorrow etched into his very being. Yet, when I watched him closely, there was no reflection of him in the window beside mine, only my own image staring back. As the train approached a particularly long stretch of tunnel, the air grew colder, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The man in black remained unwavering, his gaze never faltering. I felt a chill run down my spine, a primal fear that something was terribly wrong. The whispers of the city faded away, replaced by an oppressive silence that seemed to envelope the entire car. I decided to confront my unease head-on. Summoning all my courage, I turned to face him. "Excuse me," I began, my voice barely above a whisper. "Do you need something?" He didn't respond. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, and I saw a flicker of pain, or was it desperation, before he looked away. Returning his gaze to the window, my heart pounded in my chest, the silence between us thick with unspoken words. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing instead on the passing scenery outside. But no matter how much I tried to ignore him, the man in black seemed to anchor himself to my very existence, a spectral presence that refused to be dismissed. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the train continued its relentless journey through the night. The whispers of the city outside were now a distant memory, replaced by the incessant hum of the train's engine. I glanced around the car, noticing that other passengers seemed oblivious to the man in black, caught up in their own worlds, unaware of the supernatural anomaly seated opposite me. Desperation began to gnaw at me. I needed answers, a way to understand why this man was here and why he couldn't be seen in the reflections. I reached into my pocket, pulling out a pen and a small notebook I kept for jotting down thoughts and observations. Scribbling down a few lines, I hoped to make sense of the inexplicable. Man in black, no reflection, silent presence, feelings of sorrow and desperation, possible ghost. I shook my head, frustrated by the lack of clarity. Is this some kind of joke? I muttered to myself, the absurdity of the situation clashing with the genuine fear that had taken root inside me. As the train continued its journey, we entered a particularly dark tunnel, the lights above flickering more erratically than usual. The man in black remained steadfast, his eyes never leaving the window. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something terrible was about to unfold. Suddenly, the train jolted violently, throwing me forward in my seat. The lights above sputtered and went out, plunging the entire car into darkness. The only illumination came from the faint glow of the tunnel walls, casting long, distorted shadows that danced eerily around us. In the pitch-black silence, I could hear it, the soft, anguished sobbing of the man in black. His cries pierced the darkness, a heart-wrenching sound that resonated deep within me. I turned to look at him again, my flashlight momentarily illuminating his figure before the light flickered out. The sobbing grew louder, more desperate, echoing through the car like a mournful lament. I felt his presence pressing against me, his sorrow tangible in the oppressive darkness. My mind raced, struggling to comprehend the situation, while my body remained paralyzed by fear. Minutes, or was it hours, passed as the train hurtled through the darkness, the sobbing never ceasing. I clung to my seat, every fiber of my being yearning for the lights to come back on, for the train to reach the next station and escape this nightmare. But the man in black remained, his cries a constant reminder of the unresolved pain that bound him to this place. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the train began to slow, the lights above flickering back to life in a feeble attempt to illuminate the car. The sobbing faded, replaced by a heavy, lingering silence that seemed to press down on me like a physical weight. The train pulled into the final station, the doors sliding open to reveal the first hints of dawn breaking over the horizon. The man in black stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and approached me with a sense of finality. As he drew closer, I could see the full extent of his sorrow, his eyes hollow, his expression etched with an unbearable sadness. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant sounds of the waking city. "I can finally rest." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the morning light as the doors closed behind him. I sat there, stunned and trembling, unable to process what had just transpired. The other passengers had already left, their departures marking the end of my harrowing journey. The next morning, I tried to rationalize the events of the previous night. Was it a shared hallucination, A collective stress-induced nightmare? But deep down, I knew it was something far more sinister. The man's presence, his sorrow, and the inexplicable absence in the reflections, all pointed to a restless spirit trapped between worlds. I spoke to my colleagues about the experience, but they dismissed it as an overactive imagination fueled by the monotony of night shifts. "You're probably just stressed out," one of them suggested, offering a sympathetic pat on the back. Nothing more than that. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within me. The encounter with the man in black had left an indelible mark on my soul. A lingering sense of sorrow and empathy that I couldn't explain. I began to notice other oddities, objects slightly out of place, whispers in the dead of night, and the haunting echoes of his cries that seemed to follow me even outside the confines of the subway car. Determined to find closure, I delved deeper into the history of the subway line and the final station we had arrived at. What I discovered was a tragic tale of love and loss, a story that mirrored my own encounter with the spectral passenger. Years ago, the final station had been the site of a heartbreaking accident. A young woman named Clara Ramirez had lost her life in a tragic derailment. Her dreams and aspirations extinguished in an instant. She had been waiting for her fiancé, Daniel, who had been operating the train that fateful night. The accident had left the community in mourning, their grief etched into the very fabric of the subway line. Rumors spread of Clara's restless spirit, forever waiting for Daniel to return, her sorrow palpable in the lingering echoes of her cries. The story had been largely forgotten, overshadowed by the relentless pace of the city. But my encounter with the man in black had brought it back to life. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to perform a ritual of remembrance, hoping to offer Clara the closure she so desperately sought. I reached out to a local medium, a woman named Maria, who specialized in communicating with lost souls. Together, we returned to the final station, determined to help Clara find peace. The night of the ritual was cold and still, the subway platform bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. Maria and I set up a small altar with candles, flowers, and a photograph of Clara that I had found in the archives. We began to chant softly, our voices intertwining as we called out to her spirit, inviting her to communicate. First, there was no response. The platform remained silent, the only sound the distant rumble of passing trains. But as we continued, the air grew colder, the temperature dropping sharply as if the very essence of Clara's sorrow had filled the space. Suddenly, the lights flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the platform. The air shimmered with a spectral energy, and the soft, anguished cries of the man in black filled the space. Clara's apparition appeared before us, her eyes filled with an unbearable sadness, her form ethereal and translucent. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice a haunting melody that resonated deep within me. "I've been waiting." Tears welled up in my eyes as I stepped forward, reaching out a hand in a gesture of comfort. "Clara," I said softly, "I'm here to help you. You don't have to wait anymore." Maria began to chant louder, her voice steady and compassionate. I felt a surge of empathy, understanding the depth of Clara's pain and the endless wait for a love that had been cut short. Together, we continued our prayers, offering our support and compassion to her restless spirit. As we spoke, Clara's apparition began to glow with a soft, warm light. Her eyes met mine, and I felt a profound sense of peace wash over me. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. "I can finally let go." With those final words, Clara's spirit began to ascend, her form dissolving into the light that filled the platform. The temperature rose, the oppressive cold lifting as the shadows dissipated. The whispers and cries faded away, replaced by a serene silence that signified the end of her eternal wait. In the weeks that followed, the strange occurrences ceased entirely. The subway line felt lighter. The lingering sorrow of Clara's spirit finally laid to rest. Passengers began to notice the change, commenting on the newfound sense of calm that now permeated the final station. I continued my night shifts with a deeper understanding of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and the importance of compassion in easing the pain of those who couldn't move on. The memory of Clara's sorrow and the night we helped her find peace remained with me, a haunting reminder of the enduring power of empathy and the mysteries that lie just beyond the edges of our reality. But sometimes, late at night, when the subway tunnels echo with the soft hum of passing trains, I catch a faint whisper of gratitude carried on the breeze, a gentle reminder that some spirits never truly fade and that every cry deserves to be heard and remembered. Story number 3. Echoes in the tunnel. I've always found solace in the underground labyrinth of the subway system, the rhythmic clatter of the trains a comforting backdrop to my late-night commutes. But that cold December night in Chicago would forever change how I perceive those dark, winding tunnels. My name is Laura Mitchell, and what was meant to be a routine journey home became an experience that still haunts me to this day. It was just past midnight, the kind of hour when the city's hustle dims, and the streets outside my apartment grow eerily silent under a blanket of frost. I had left work later than usual, the fluorescent lights of the office replaced by the dim glow of street lamps guiding me toward the nearest subway entrance. Wrapped in my favorite scarf, I descended the steps into the cool, subterranean air of the subway station, the familiar scent of damp concrete and metal enveloping me. The station was nearly empty, save for a few solitary figures huddled against the pillars or lost in their own thoughts. I swiped my Metro card, the green light blinking in acknowledgement, and boarded the train heading downtown. Finding an empty seat, I settled in, pulling out my phone to pass the time until my stop. The train hummed to life, sliding smoothly into the darkness, the tunnel stretching endlessly ahead. As the train sped through the underground tunnels, I glanced out the window, watching the fleeting shadows of passing stations dissolve into the darkness. The rhythmic motion lulled me into a sense of calm, until something shifted. It started subtly, an almost imperceptible echo of footsteps, soft and deliberate, trailing just behind me. I glanced over my shoulder, expecting to see another passenger. But the car was empty except for me and a few late-night commuters, each lost in their own world. Shaking off the unease, I returned my focus to my phone, but the sound persisted, growing slightly louder with each passing minute. Footsteps. Someone was walking behind me, their steps matching mine in pace and rhythm. My heart began to race, a chill crawling up my spine despite the warmth of the carriage. I turned around again, this time more forcefully, but still, there was no one there. I wasn't the first to experience oddities on these late-night trains, but I had always dismissed them as tricks of the mind, phantoms of fatigue and stress. Yet, tonight felt different. The footsteps were too consistent, too real to ignore. I felt a presence, an invisible shadow that clung to my every move, echoing my steps in a haunting mimicry, determined to confront whatever or whoever was behind the unsettling sounds. I stood up, clutching my bag tightly. The empty seat beside me felt colder, the air heavier as I moved toward the door at the end of the car. The footsteps followed, each step resonating in the hollow space. I reached the door, hesitated for a moment, then leaned out slightly, peering into the dimly lit corridor. The platform was deserted, the flickering lights casting long, wavering shadows across the tiles. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and opened the door. A blast of cold air greeted me, the distant sounds of the city muffled by the thick walls of the tunnel. I stepped onto the platform, expecting to see a passenger, someone I could confront or perhaps reassure myself that it was all in my head. But there was no one there, just the vast expanse of empty track and the distant echo of trains passing by. I turned to close the door, but froze as I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps resuming their pursuit. Panic surged through me as I raced back into the train, slamming the door shut behind me. The footsteps intensified, now matching my every move as I sprinted down the aisle, my breaths coming in ragged gasps. Passengers glanced at me with puzzled expressions, but no one offered help, their eyes darting away as if sensing the same invisible threat I felt. I tried to regain my composure, my mind racing for explanations. Maybe it was a prank, someone trying to scare me, but the persistence of the footsteps suggested something far more sinister. I grabbed my phone, intending to call a friend for reassurance, but my fingers froze on the screen as I watched my reflection in the window. There, standing behind me, was the silhouette of a man dressed entirely in black, his features obscured by the darkness. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the train. My blood ran cold as I spun around, but he was gone. The reflection remained, a ghostly image that mirrored my terror. I stumbled backward, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The footsteps had stopped, leaving behind an oppressive silence that felt like a physical weight pressing down on me. Desperate to escape, I leaned against the wall, my mind frantically searching for a way out. The train approached my stop, the announcement blaring through the speakers, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to abandon the seat and find safety, but the fear held me captive, paralyzed by the unseen presence that seemed to watch my every move. As the train pulled into the station, I forced myself to stand, pushing past the lingering fear that kept me rooted to the spot. The doors slid open, revealing the familiar sights of the platform, the comforting hustle of early morning commuters preparing for their day. I stepped out, breathless and trembling, glancing back one last time. The empty car stared back at me, the ghostly figure nowhere to be found, leaving me with more questions than answers. The next day, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. I recounted the experience to my friend, Sarah, hoping for some rational explanation. She listened intently, her eyes wide with concern. "Maybe you saw a ghost," she suggested softly. "Something tied to the train or the tunnels." Intrigued and unsettled, I decided to dig deeper into the history of the subway line I had traveled. The local library and historical society became my sanctuaries, where I pored over old records and newspaper clippings. What I discovered was a chilling tale of tragedy and loss that mirrored my own experience. Years ago, the subway tunnels had been the site of a devastating accident, a collision caused by a faulty signal that sent two trains hurtling toward each other in the dead of night. The crash had claimed the lives of dozens of passengers, leaving families shattered and the community in mourning. Among the victims was a woman named Clara Thompson, who had been returning home after visiting her sick mother. Clara had been seated alone in her compartment, her last moments lost to the chaos and destruction. Rumors swirled about Clara's restless spirit, forever wandering the tunnels in search of peace, her cries echoing through the darkness of the underground. Some believed she was trapped between worlds, unable to move on from the tragic event that claimed her life. Armed with this knowledge, I felt a profound sense of responsibility to help Clara find the closure she so desperately needed. I reached out to a local medium, a woman named Maria, who specialized in communicating with restless spirits. Together, we returned to the subway line, determined to offer Clara the peace she had been denied. The night we conducted the séance was cold and still, the air thick with anticipation. We stood in the empty station, the flickering lights casting long shadows on the tiled floor. Maria began to chant softly, her voice intertwining with mine as we called out to Clara, inviting her to communicate. First, there was no response. The tunnels remained silent, the oppressive weight of Clara's sorrow palpable in the air. But as we continued, the atmosphere began to shift. A chill swept through the station, the temperature dropping sharply as if Clara's presence had been acknowledged. The sound of footsteps echoed through the tunnels, growing louder and more distinct, matching the rhythm of our chants. Suddenly, the air grew heavy, and the flickering lights steadied, casting a warm glow over the platform. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman in a long, flowing dress, her face etched with sorrow and longing. Clara stood before us, her eyes filled with an unbearable sadness. "I can't move on," she whispered, her voice a haunting melody that resonated deep within me. "I'm still waiting." I stepped forward, reaching out a hand in a gesture of comfort. "Clara, we're here to help you. Let us guide you to peace." Maria began to chant louder, her voice steady and compassionate. Together, we continued our prayers, offering our support and empathy to Clara's restless spirit. The air shimmered with a spectral energy, and Clara's form began to glow with a soft, ethereal light. Her sorrowful expression softened as the pain in her eyes began to fade. "Thank you," she whispered, a hint of gratitude in her voice. "I can finally let go." With those final words, Clara's spirit began to ascend, her form dissolving into the light that filled the station. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a sense of peace and fulfillment. The footsteps ceased, and the darkness of the tunnels was filled with a serene silence that signified the end of Clara's eternal wait. In the weeks that followed, the strange occurrences on the subway line ceased entirely. The whispers and footsteps were gone, replaced by the usual hum of the trains and the bustling energy of the morning rush. Passengers began to notice a subtle change, a newfound sense of calm and tranquility that seemed to permeate the tunnels. I continued my night shifts with a deeper appreciation for the unseen forces that linger in the world, a respect for the stories of those who had been lost and the enduring power of compassion in easing their pain. The memory of Clara's tragic fate and the night we helped her find peace remained with me, a haunting reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and the mysteries that lie just beyond the edges of our reality. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind whistles through the tunnels and the city sleeps under a blanket of frost, I catch a faint echo of Clara's soft laughter carried on the breeze, a gentle, lingering reminder that some spirits never truly fade and that every cry deserves to be heard and remembered. Story number 4. The Headless Passenger. I never believed in ghosts. Growing up in the bustling heart of Houston, Texas, my nights were filled with the sounds of city life, honking cars, distant sirens, and the occasional late-night revelry. But working the night shift as a subway conductor on Line 6 had a way of stripping away the city's facade, revealing a darkness I never knew existed. My name is Mark Lawson, and for the past 2 years, I've been navigating the labyrinthine tunnels of Houston's underground, ensuring that passengers reach their destinations safely. Most nights were uneventful, with the train humming steadily through the darkness, the lights above flickering intermittently as we journeyed from one station to the next. That all changed on a frigid December night. It was around 1 a.m. when I received a routine report of a passenger boarding at the last stop. The station was nearly empty, save for a solitary figure huddled against the cold. Bundled up in a long, dark coat, I welcomed him aboard with a polite nod, his face obscured by the brim of his hat. He didn't speak, didn't offer a greeting, just sat quietly in the farthest seat at the end of the car. As the train departed, the temperature inside seemed to drop, a chill settling over the carriage that made my skin prickle. I glanced back at the man, feeling an inexplicable unease. His presence was unsettling, a silent shadow amidst the few other passengers who nodded off or stared blankly out the windows. The journey was smooth until we entered one of the older, less maintained sections of the tunnel. The lights began to flicker more erratically, casting long, distorted shadows across the seats. It was then that I saw it, a figure sitting across from me, identical to the man who had boarded earlier, except for one horrifying difference. He had no head. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a distorted reflection from the window pane. Maybe I was just tired, my eyes playing tricks on me after hours behind the control panel. I rubbed my eyes, blinked rapidly, but when I looked again, the headless man was still there, staring blankly ahead with hollow eye sockets that seemed to bore into my very soul. My heart raced as I tried to maintain my composure. I glanced around, searching for any sign that the man was real, someone else noticing him. any indication that this was more than just my imagination. But the other passengers remained oblivious, lost in their own worlds of sleep or silent contemplation. Panicking, I decided to change the train cars, hoping to rid myself of the eerie presence. I pulled the emergency brake and waited as the train slowly moved to the next station. As the doors opened, the headless man remained seated, motionless and unresponsive. Without a word, I boarded the next car, quickly locking the doors behind me. But the feeling of being watched didn't dissipate. Instead, it intensified, a heavy weight pressing down on me from behind. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was just stress from the long shift and the isolation of the night. But as the train continued its journey, the footsteps began. Soft, deliberate steps echoed through the empty car, matching my every move. I spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was no one there, just the oppressive silence of the night. The footsteps continued, growing louder and more insistent, always just out of sight. I could feel the presence of someone or something following me, their movements synchronized with mine. My mind raced, torn between rational explanations and the horrifying possibility that I was being stalked by a spectral entity. As the train approached the next tunnel, the lights dimmed further, plunging the car into near darkness. The footsteps quickened, now accompanied by a faint whisper that seemed to call my name. Mark! Mark! I backed away, heart pounding, trying to distance myself from the unseen follower. The train screeched into another dark tunnel, the sudden jolt sending a surge of adrenaline through my veins. I pressed myself against the wall, breathing heavily, as the footsteps and whispers grew louder, more urgent, desperate to escape. I made my way to the front of the train, hoping to confront whatever was haunting me. As I reached the conductor's cabin, I turned to look back at the empty car, only to find the headless man standing up, his movements jerky and unnatural. He glided towards me, the lack of a head making his presence even more terrifying. "Leave, now," the whisper echoed, though no sound seemed to emanate from him. I stumbled backward, tripping over my own feet as panic took full control. The train began to slow, pulling into the final station, an abandoned platform rarely used by late-night passengers. I sprinted out of the cabin, fleeing down the aisle as the headless man pursued me, his footsteps echoing in the empty car. The doors to the train opened, and I dashed through, barely making it out before the train doors slammed shut behind me. Gasping for breath, I looked back to see the headless figure standing at the entrance, watching me with his empty gaze. The station was deserted, the cold night air biting at my skin as I tried to steady my racing heart. I reached out to the security guard, but he simply stared blankly, his eyes glazed over with a hollow emptiness that mirrored the man I had just fled from. "What's happening?" I demanded, my voice shaking with fear. He didn't respond, his silence more unsettling than any words could have been. I turned back towards the subway, but the headless man was nowhere to be seen, as if he had vanished into thin air. Shaken and terrified, I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my belongings and left the station, not daring to look back. In the days that followed, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. The image of the headless man haunted my every thought, his empty gaze a constant reminder of the unexplained terror I had faced. I spoke to my colleagues, hoping for some rational explanation, but they dismissed my experience as stress-induced hallucinations, a product of the long, lonely nights spent in the underground tunnels. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. The whispers, the footsteps, the presence of something or someone beyond the realm of the living. I began to research the history of Line 6, digging through old records and newspaper archives, hoping to find some clue to the mystery. What I discovered sent chills down my spine. Years ago, a tragic accident had occurred on Line 6, a derailment caused by a faulty signal, resulting in the deaths of several passengers, including a man named Thomas Walker. Thomas had been a dedicated worker at the station, known for his kindness and unwavering commitment to his job. On the night of the accident, he had been on duty, trying to manage the chaos as the train derailed. But he never made it out alive. According to the reports, Thomas had been last seen heading towards the front of the train, assisting passengers. Before the crash, his body was never fully recovered, and rumors began to circulate about his restless spirit, forever trapped on Line 6, unable to move on from the tragedy that claimed his life. As I pieced together the story, the connection between Thomas Walker and the headless man became unmistakable. It was as if his spirit, tormented by the accident and unable to find peace, had manifested in the form of the headless passenger, seeking closure and understanding. Determined to help him find peace, I decided to return to the station one final time, armed with knowledge and a resolve to confront the restless spirit. I returned to the train that had haunted me, waiting for the next late-night shift to board Line 6. As the train pulled into the station, I felt a familiar chill settle over me, the air thick with anticipation. I boarded the train, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and determination. As the doors closed, I took a seat in the same spot where I had first encountered the headless man. The train began to move, sliding smoothly into the darkness of the tunnel. I steeled myself, prepared to face whatever awaited me. As we approached the next tunnel, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped once more. The footsteps began, soft and deliberate, trailing behind me as I had experienced before. I turned to confront the headless man, my voice steady despite the fear gripping my chest. "Thomas," I called out, my voice echoing through the empty car. "I'm here to help you. You don't have to be alone anymore." The headless man stood up, his movements more fluid this time, as if responding to my words. His gaze met mine, the emptiness of his eyes now filled with a profound sadness and longing. "Help me," he whispered, his voice carrying the weight of countless unspoken emotions. I reached out a hand, feeling an invisible barrier between us, yet determined to bridge the gap. "I'm sorry for what happened. Let me help you find peace." A surge of energy filled the car, the oppressive cold lifting as if the very air had been cleared of its torment. The headless man began to glow with a soft, ethereal light, his form becoming more defined, his sorrowful expression slowly transforming into one of gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, a hint of relief in his voice. "I can finally rest." With those final words, his form began to dissolve, the light enveloping him as he ascended into the darkness, leaving behind a sense of peace and closure that had been missing for so long. The whispers ceased, replaced by the gentle hum of the train as it continued its journey through the night. As the train pulled into the next station, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment wash over me. Thomas Walker had found the peace he so desperately sought, his restless spirit finally free from the confines of the underground tunnels. The headless passenger was no more, his tragic story now a part of the legacy of Line 6, a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the human spirit's ability to overcome even the darkest of tragedies. I stepped off the train, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon, casting a warm glow on the platform. The memories of that night lingered, a haunting reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and the mysteries that lie just beyond our understanding. But sometimes, late at night, when the trains run through the darkness and the city sleeps under a blanket of frost, I catch a faint echo of gratitude carried on the breeze, a gentle whisper that assures me some spirits never truly fade and that every cry deserves to be heard and remembered. Story number 5. Whispers of Union Square. I've always found solace in the quiet rhythm of my nightly duties. As the janitor of Union Square Station, I've seen the city's heartbeat slow to a steady thump while most of the world above slumbers. The station, a sprawling nexus of steel and concrete, stands as a testament to the city's relentless pulse. But beneath its polished surface lies a labyrinth of stories best left untold. It was on one such cold December night that I encountered a presence that would forever alter my perception of reality. The The night had settled in early, the winter air biting through the gaps in my coat as I made my rounds. Union Square was a hub of activity, even at this hour, with the occasional late-night traveler or two seeking refuge from the chill. The platform was dimly lit, shadows dancing along the walls as the flickering lights cast eerie patterns on the tiled floor. I pushed my cart down the corridor, the soft squeak of the wheels the only sound breaking the silence. As I reached the edge of the platform, where the tracks lay exposed beneath a glass barrier, I felt a familiar sense of unease. The area was rarely busy at this hour, and the oppressive stillness seemed to amplify every creak and groan of the aging infrastructure. I paused, glancing around to ensure I wasn't alone. The station was deserted, the only movement coming from the occasional sway of a distant tree branch outside the window. That's when I saw him, a man standing at the far end of the tracks, his figure stark against the darkened background. He was dressed in clothes that seemed centuries out of place. A long, dark coat that brushed the tops of his shoes, a wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. His posture was rigid, and he stood motionless, staring intently down the tracks as if waiting for something or someone. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection or a shadow playing games with my tired eyes. But as I watched, the man's presence remained unervingly consistent, unwavering despite the movement of the world around him. My heart began to race, a primal fear taking hold as I debated whether to approach or retreat. Gathering my courage, I decided to investigate. The cold seeped into my bones as I walked closer, the chill of the night air contrasting sharply with the warmth of the station. Each step felt heavier than the last, the silence pressing in on me from all sides. As I drew nearer, the man's features became clearer, though still obscured by the darkness of his attire. His eyes, or what should have been his eyes, were hollow, empty voids that seemed to pull me in. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice wavering slightly in the stillness. He didn't respond. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging my presence but choosing not to engage. I reached out a hand, feeling an inexplicable urge to touch him, to bridge the gap between our worlds. But before my fingers could make contact, the temperature around me dropped precipitously, a wave of cold washing over the platform. I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around me, my breath visible in the frigid air. The man began to fade, his form becoming translucent, blending seamlessly with the shadows. Panic surged through me as I took a step back, only to see him disappear entirely, leaving behind an overwhelming sense of loss and sorrow. Stunned, I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. The station remained silent, the only evidence of his existence the lingering chill and the faint echo of his presence. I glanced around, half expecting to see him reappear, but the platform was as empty as before. Shaken, I made my way back to the main hall, my mind racing with questions. Who was he? Why was he here? And most importantly, why did his presence feel so achingly familiar, as if he was a part of something I couldn't quite grasp? The following day, curiosity gnawed at me. I decided to delve into the history of Union Square Station, hoping to uncover any clues that might explain the apparition I had encountered. The local library became my sanctuary, where I pored over old newspaper clippings and faded photographs. What I discovered was a tale of tragedy and loss that sent chills down my spine. Decades ago, Union Square had been the site of a devastating accident, a derailment caused by a faulty signal that resulted in the deaths of several passengers. Among the victims was a man named Thomas Everett, a dedicated worker at the station known for his kindness and unwavering commitment. On that fateful night, he had been on duty, ensuring the trains ran smoothly, when disaster struck. His body was never fully recovered, and rumors began to circulate about his restless spirit, forever haunting the very place where his life had been cut short. As I read through the accounts, the pieces began to fit together. The man I had seen was Thomas Everett, his spirit unable to move on, trapped in a perpetual state of waiting and sorrow. His presence at the station was a lingering reminder of the tragedy that had once unfolded, his unresolved grief manifesting in the form of a ghostly apparition. Determined to help him find peace, I reached out to a local medium, a woman named Maria, who specialized in communicating with restless spirits. Together, we returned to Union Square on a cold, clear night, armed with candles, incense, and a deep sense of empathy. We set up a small altar near the tracks, our voices soft and soothing as we called out to Thomas, offering our support and understanding. As we began to chant, the air grew thick with an ethereal energy, the shadows of the night seemingly coming alive around us. The temperature dropped once more, the cold intensifying as if responding to our presence. Suddenly, the apparition of Thomas Everett appeared before us, his hollow eyes meeting ours with a mixture of sorrow and longing. "I can't move on," he whispered, his voice a haunting melody that echoed through the station. "I'm still waiting." Maria stepped forward, her voice gentle and compassionate. "Thomas, we're here to help you. You don't have to wait anymore. Let us guide you to peace." Thomas reached out a hand, his fingers barely touching the air between us. The pain in his eyes was palpable, a silent plea for release from his eternal vigil. I felt a surge of empathy, understanding the depth of his suffering and the weight of his unresolved grief. As we continued our prayers, the oppressive cold began to lift, replaced by a warm, comforting energy that filled the station. The apparition of Thomas Everett softened, his form becoming more defined, his sorrowful expression slowly transforming into one of gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with a sense of relief and acceptance. "I can finally rest." With those final words, Thomas's spirit began to ascend, his form dissolving into the light that now bathed the platform. The lingering chill dissipated, leaving behind a serene silence that signified the end of his torment. Maria and I stood there, watching as the remnants of his presence faded away, a sense of peace settling over Union Square Station. In the days that followed, the station felt different, lighter, more welcoming, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. The stories of hauntings and restless spirits faded into the background, replaced by the everyday rhythm of commuters and travelers. But for me, the memory of that night remained, a haunting reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and the enduring power of compassion in easing the pain of those who cannot move on. Sometimes, late at night, as I make my rounds through the now peaceful corridors of Union Square, I catch a faint whisper on the wind, a soft, lingering echo of gratitude carried on the breeze. It's a gentle reminder that some spirits never truly fade, and that every cry deserves to be heard and remembered. Story number 6. The Frosted Carriage. I never thought my nightly commute on the 7 train would become the stuff of nightmares. As a graduate student juggling research and part-time jobs, the subway was my lifeline, ferrying me through the sleepless hours of late-night study sessions and early morning lectures. But one bitterly cold December night turned my routine journey into an experience I still can't fully explain. It was around midnight, the kind of hour when the city's hustle dims, and the underground tunnels of the subway become a silent, winding maze. I boarded the train at the last stop, Cloverdale, just as the clock struck 12. The platform was nearly empty, save for a few solitary figures seeking refuge from the biting cold outside. I slid into a window seat in the middle car, pulling my coat tighter against the chill that seemed to seep into my bones despite the heated air circulating within the train. The train lurched forward, sliding smoothly into the darkness of the tunnel. The rhythmic clatter of the tracks was soothing, a familiar lullaby that usually made the late hours bearable. I pulled out my notebook, intent on organizing my research notes, but my mind was already wandering, thoughts tangled in the stress of deadlines and endless assignments. About 15 minutes into the ride, I glanced up from my notebook, expecting to see another weary traveler or maybe a fellow student lost in their own world. Instead, the car appeared entirely empty. No passengers. No movement. Just the ghostly silence amplified by the flickering overhead lights. At first, I thought it was a glitch. Perhaps the train had been mistakenly flagged as unoccupied. But as the minutes dragged on, unease began to settle in. I looked around again, heart pounding slightly faster. The absence of other passengers was unnerving, an eerie emptiness that seemed to stretch on indefinitely. Just as I was about to dismiss it as a trick of my tired mind, the doors at the far end of the car slid open with a soft hiss. I turned to see a man boarding, his presence stark against the barren backdrop. He was dressed in a long, dark coat, his face obscured by the brim of a wide hat. Something about him was off, a chilling aura that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. He took a seat directly across from me, his movements deliberate and slow. I couldn't help but stare, drawn by a sense of curiosity and an underlying fear. His eyes, visible beneath the shadow of his hat, held a depth of sorrow that seemed almost palpable. For a moment, the car remained silent except for the distant hum of the train's engine. As the train continued its journey through the labyrinthine tunnels, I felt a strange sensation, like icy fingers tracing down my spine. The lights above flickered again, casting fleeting shadows that danced along the empty seats. I glanced back at the man, expecting him to react or perhaps engage in conversation. But he remained motionless, his gaze fixed on the window ahead. Then, without warning, the temperature in the car plummeted. A biting cold enveloped me, despite the train's heating system working overtime to counter the winter chill outside. My breath became visible, swirling in the frigid air as I pulled my scarf tighter around my neck. The man in the dark coat didn't move, but I could feel his presence pressing against me, an invisible weight that made it hard to breathe. I decided to break the silence, my voice barely above a whisper. "Cold night." "Ha!" He didn't respond. Instead, his head remained bowed, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. I felt a pang of sympathy, a desire to reach out and offer comfort. But the fear kept me rooted to my seat. The car felt like a void, the absence of other passengers amplifying the sense of isolation and dread that now settled over me. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours as the train hurtled through the darkness. The man's silent vigil continued, his sorrowful eyes never leaving the window. I tried to focus on my notes, but the oppressive atmosphere made it impossible to concentrate. The only sound was the relentless clatter of the tracks and the distant echoes of the train's movement through the tunnels. Suddenly, the man in the dark coat began to stir. He slowly lifted his head, his hollow eyes meeting mine. A chill ran down my spine as I stared into the empty void where his eyes should have been. His face, if you could call it that, was devoid of any features, an unsettling emptiness that made him look like a shadow given form. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and concern. He didn't respond. Instead, he reached out a hand, his fingers long and unnaturally cold, pointing toward the window. I followed his gaze, expecting to see something unusual outside, but the tunnel remained dark, the only light coming from the occasional flicker of overhead lamps. Then, as quickly as it had started, the gesture stopped. The man leaned back in his seat, and the temperature began to rise, the icy grip loosening as if released by an unseen force. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, feeling a slight relief wash over me. But the sense of unease remained, lingering like a shadow that refused to dissipate. The train began to slow as we approached the next station, a place I didn't recognize on the route map. The doors opened, and the man in the dark coat stood up, his movements fluid and silent. He made his way to the end of the car, pausing for a moment before stepping into the darkness outside. As he moved away, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched, the memory of his hollow gaze lingering in my mind. I waited for the train to depart, hoping that the apparition would remain a fleeting memory, a trick of the light and my overactive imagination. But as the train pulled away, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, a reflection in the window that shouldn't have been there. There, standing at the far end of the car, was the man without a head, staring directly at me with his empty eyes. Panic surged through me as I realized the truth. He was still there, trapped within the confines of the train. His sorrowful presence an eternal reminder of the night I spent alone in a frozen, empty carriage. I stepped off the train at my stop, my legs trembling as I made my way through the bustling station. The encounter left me shaken, the memory of the headless man lingering like a ghost in the recesses of my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, a spectral presence that clung to me long after the train had departed. In the days that followed, I found myself avoiding late-night trains, unable to bear the thought of reliving that harrowing experience. But the image of the man without a head, his hollow eyes filled with sorrow, continued to haunt me, a constant reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and the mysteries that lie hidden in the darkness of the night. Story number 7. Echoes of Innocence. I've always found the night shifts at Grand Central Terminal oddly comforting. The steady hum of the trains, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks, and the distant murmur of sleeping passengers create a lullaby that lulls me into a trance-like state. My name is Michael Turner, and for the past 5 years, I've been working as a maintenance engineer, ensuring that the intricate web of tracks and signals operates smoothly through the darkest hours. But one cold December night shattered that sense of security, plunging me into a nightmare that still haunts me to this day. It was just past midnight, the kind of hour when the city above is wrapped in a blanket of silence, and the only sounds below are the distant echoes of trains passing through the tunnels. I was making my routine check of the tracks near the north end of the terminal, a section that older employees warned me had a history I'd rather forget. They spoke of accidents and lost souls, tales meant to keep newcomers cautious. I dismissed them as old ghost stories, relics of a bygone era when the terminal was bustling with unending activity. As I walked along the deserted platform, the biting cold seeped through my coat, and my breath formed visible puffs in the frigid air. The lights above flickered sporadically, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I reached the designated spot, a narrow pathway beside the tracks, and began my inspection. That's when I heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of a child's cry. At first, I thought it was the wind, swirling through the tunnels and playing with the debris left behind by the rush of passengers. But the cry was too distinct, too filled with pain and fear to be mere gusts of wind. I froze, listening intently. The cry continued, echoing through the empty station, growing louder and more desperate. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to locate the source. The sound seemed to be coming from the end of the platform, where the lights were dimmer and the shadows thicker. Summoning my courage, I decided to investigate. I pulled out my flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness, and moved cautiously toward the sound. Each step felt heavier than the last, the cold pressing against me like icy fingers gripping my soul. As I approached the far end of the platform, the crying intensified, now accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps crunching on the gravel. My mind raced with possibilities, perhaps a lost child, scared and alone, needing help, quickened my pace, the weight of responsibility urging me forward. Then, I saw her, a small figure standing near the edge of the tracks, wrapped in a tattered coat, her face obscured by the shadows. She looked no older than 7 or 8, her body trembling as she clung to the cold metal railing. Her presence was both heartbreaking and unsettling, a stark contrast to the sterile, mechanical environment of the terminal. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out gently, trying to mask the fear creeping into my voice. She didn't respond. Instead, she lifted her head slightly, revealing hollow, lifeless eyes that seemed to stare right through me. My blood ran cold as I realized there was something unnatural about her presence. I took a hesitant step forward, the flashlight beam revealing more of her figure. Her clothes were old-fashioned, the kind you'd expect to see decades ago, not in the modern sprawl of Grand Central. Her hair was disheveled, and her small hands were clasped tightly around the railing, knuckles white from the cold. "Do you need help? Can I call someone for you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Still, she remained silent, her eyes fixed on the tracks as if waiting for someone to arrive. The air around us grew colder, the oppressive chill seeping into my bones and making it difficult to breathe. I reached out a hand, desperate to offer comfort, but she recoiled as if repelled by an unseen force. "Please, I can help you," pleaded, stepping closer. Suddenly, the lights above flickered violently, and the cry of the child intensified into a wail that pierced the stillness of the night. I felt a surge of panic as the shadows around us seemed to come alive, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that danced along the walls. Before I could react, the ground beneath me began to tremble, the vibrations shaking the very foundation of the terminal. The crying turned into anguished screams, echoing through the tunnels and reverberating off the concrete walls. I stumbled, losing my balance as the world around me seemed to distort and warp. The little girl vanished before my eyes, leaving behind an icy void where her presence had been. I stood there, trembling and disoriented, the sounds of chaos drowning out my thoughts. The terminal was no longer a place of order and routine but a realm of horror and despair, the tragic echoes of the past intertwining with the present. I turned to flee, the sense of being watched intensifying with every step. The footsteps returned, now matching my pace, relentless and unyielding. My mind raced to make sense of what was happening, but the reality before me was anything but logical. As I hurried through the terminal, the screams of the child echoed in my ears, blending with the rhythmic clatter of the trains. I could feel the cold pressing against me from all sides, a suffocating embrace that made it hard to move. The shadows seemed to reach out, their grasp tightening around me, pulling me deeper into the darkness. I reached the entrance of the platform, the bright lights above a beacon of hope in the enveloping gloom. But as I stepped out into the cold night air, the screams followed me, a haunting reminder that some tragedies are never truly left behind. Shaken and breathless, I made my way back to my office, my mind reeling from the night's events. I tried to rationalize what I had seen and heard, but the fear and confusion lingered like a shadow over my thoughts. The next morning, I shared my experience with a few trusted colleagues, hoping to find some semblance of understanding. They listened quietly, their expressions sympathetic yet skeptical. One of the older workers nodded solemnly. "You know, there have been rumors about that section of the terminal. An accident a few years back. Some of the tracks were damaged, and they had to shut down the area for repairs. Some say the spirits of those who lost their lives still linger, unable to move on." I nodded, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The little girl, the cries, the coldness, it all pointed to a tragic past that had left its mark on the very infrastructure I was tasked with maintaining. Determined to find closure, I decided to delve deeper into the history of Grand Central, uncovering stories of accidents and lost souls that had long been forgotten by the bustling city above. In the weeks that followed, I became obsessed with uncovering the truth behind the mysterious cries and apparitions. I scoured old newspaper archives, interviewed longtime employees, and even visited local historical societies. The more I learned, the more the lines between reality and the supernatural blurred. The accident had occurred during a particularly harsh winter, a storm so fierce that the tracks were compromised, leading to a catastrophic derailment. Among the victims was a young girl, her life cut short in the chaos of the disaster. Her spirit, it seemed, was forever bound to the tracks, her cries a testament to the tragedy that had unfolded in the cold shadows of Grand Central. Armed with this knowledge, I felt a responsibility to help her find peace, to bring closure to the restless soul that haunted the terminal. I reached out to a local medium, a woman named Maria, known for her ability to communicate with the spirits of the departed. Together, we returned to the platform, determined to offer solace to the lost girl. The night of the séance was cold and silent, the terminal eerily still under the light of the moon. Maria and I set up a small altar near the edge of the tracks, lighting candles and placing offerings of flowers and toys, a gesture of compassion for the young soul trapped in limbo. We began to chant softly, our voices intertwining as we called out to the spirit of the lost girl, inviting her to communicate and find the peace she so desperately sought. First, there was no response, the air thick with anticipation and the lingering echoes of past sorrows. But as the minutes passed, the temperature began to drop, the chill of the night seeping into the very fabric of the terminal. The candles flickered, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. Then, the crying began, not the frantic wails of before, but a soft, sorrowful whisper that filled the space around us. "Help me," the voice pleaded, a sound so filled with pain that it sent shivers down my spine. The shadows coalesced into a faint, ghostly figure, a young girl, her eyes hollow and filled with an unending sorrow. I felt a surge of empathy, understanding the depth of her pain and the weight of her unfulfilled longing. "We're here to help you," I spoke softly, my voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. "You don't have to be alone anymore," Maria continued to chant, her voice a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. The ghostly figure of the girl began to glow with a soft, ethereal light, her expression slowly transforming from sorrow to gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a gentle breeze that carried away the lingering sadness. "I can finally rest." With those final words, the apparition dissolved into the light, leaving behind a sense of peace that settled over the terminal like a warm embrace. The coldness lifted, replaced by a comforting warmth that signified the end of her eternal vigil. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Grand Central changed. The oppressive cold and the haunting cries were gone, replaced by the usual bustling energy of the city. Passengers noticed the difference, commenting on the newfound sense of calm and serenity that now enveloped the terminal. I continued my night shifts with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that I had played a part in helping a lost soul find peace. The memory of that night remained with me, a haunting reminder of the thin veil between the living and the dead, and the enduring power of compassion in easing the pain of those who cannot move on. But sometimes, late at night, when the winds howl through the tunnels and the city sleeps under a blanket of frost, I catch a faint echo of a child's laugh carried on the breeze, a gentle, lingering reminder that some spirits never truly fade and that every cry deserves to be heard and remembered.